Nobody noticed her hands. That was always the thing about Serena Cole. People looked at her and saw exactly what she wanted them to see. A quiet woman, simply dressed, sitting at a table full of people who had spent more on their watches than she had, apparently, on her entire wardrobe. They looked at her the way people look at a background detail in a painting. Present, forgettable, unimportant. Not one person in that ballroom thought to look at her hands. Because if they had, if anyone had leaned close enough to notice, they would have seen something strange, something that didn't fit. There was no tension in them, no trembling, no fingernails pressing white half-moons into her palms the way a person's hands behave when they are ambushed in public, humiliated in front of 60 strangers, and handed a legal document designed to remind them of exactly how little they are worth. Her hands were completely still, resting flat on the white tablecloth like she was waiting for a meal she had already ordered. He stood over her, Carter Voss, $10 million of arrogance in a tailored suit, and his lawyer placed the folder in front of her with the practiced confidence of a man who had done this before. Carter smiled down at her, the kind of smile that expects applause, and said, "It's just protection, sweetheart. For both of us." His mother, seated at the far end of the table in her signature pearls, did not blink. 62 guests held their breath, and Serena looked at the folder, picked up her champagne glass, took one slow, unhurried sip, set it back down without a sound, and then she looked up at Carter with an expression that no one in that room could quite name, something between amusement and pity, and she smiled. Not the smile of someone swallowing humiliation, not the smile of someone buying time. It was the smile of a woman who had already moved 3 steps ahead of everyone in the building. The smile of someone watching a plan she had set in motion hours ago begin to unfold exactly the way she knew it would. Nobody understood that smile in the moment, but they would. Oh, they absolutely would. If you are new to this channel, welcome. And I mean that sincerely, because you have arrived on a very good day. This is the kind of story that reminds you why patience is the most dangerous weapon a person can carry. Before we go any further, do me a quick favor. Hit subscribe, tap that notification bell, and drop a comment below telling me where in the world you are watching this from. I want to see every single location. Now let's go back to where this story truly begins, because the moment in that ballroom only makes sense when you understand the 2 people who were sitting at that table, and exactly how different they were from everything the other one assumed. Carter Voss was the kind of man who announced himself before he entered a room. Not loudly, not with noise or theatrics. He did it the way people who have grown up with money learn to do it. Through posture, through timing, through the particular way he paused in doorways just long enough for people to register that someone significant had arrived. He was 38 years old, sharp-jawed, broad-shouldered, with eyes the color of pale winter sky and a mind that was always calculating something. His family had built their fortune across 2 generations of real estate, private equity, and the quiet ruthlessness of men who understood that the real game was never the one being played on the surface. His father had been the same way. His grandfather before that. Wealth in the Voss household wasn't discussed over dinner. It was simply the water they all swam in. So deeply embedded in their identity that separating the man from the money was something Carter had genuinely never considered doing. By 30, he had doubled his inheritance. By 35, he had tripled it. $10 million, carefully grown, carefully guarded, carefully used as the measuring stick against which he evaluated every relationship he had ever entered. He had been engaged once before, a woman named Diana, beautiful and sharp, who had eventually grown tired of being treated like a line item in a quarterly review. That relationship ended with lawyers and bitterness and a version of events that Carter had retold so many times he had forgotten which parts were true. His mother, Margaret, a precise, elegant woman who wore her pearls the way other people wore armor, had shaped him carefully and completely. She told him often that a smart man never let love cloud his judgment. that the women who seemed least interested in his money were often the most dangerous. That protection wasn't cold, it was wisdom. And Carter, who had worshipped his mother's intelligence since childhood, had absorbed every word like scripture. He saw relationships the way he saw business: assets, liabilities, risk management. And when he met Serena, he decided, very quickly, very confidently, that she was an asset. A simple, uncomplicated, low-risk asset. That assessment would become the most expensive mistake of his life. Serena Cole was 35 years old, and she had perfected the art of being underestimated. It wasn't something she had stumbled into accidentally. It was a deliberate, years-long practice, refined the way an athlete refines a technique, through repetition, through discipline, through an acute understanding of what people see when they look at a woman who doesn't flaunt what she has. She drove a car that was 4 years old. She rented an apartment in a quiet part of the city that her neighbors described as decent. She wore clothes that were well-made but never branded. She went to dinners and sat at tables and asked thoughtful questions and listened more than she spoke, and consistently, reliably, left people with the comfortable impression that she was pleasant and intelligent but unremarkable. The truth was almost funny. Serena Cole was worth just over $300 million. It had not come from inheritance, though her parents had been comfortable. It had come from 15 years of extraordinarily precise decisions in private equity and technology investment, made quietly and with the kind of long-view patience that most investors spend entire careers trying to develop. She had backed 3 companies before they became household names. She had exited 2 investments with returns that made her financial advisors call her with voices that sounded slightly stunned. She owned properties in 4 states and 2 countries under holding companies that bore no resemblance to her name. Nobody outside her small, trusted circle knew any of this. She had kept it that way on purpose. Serena had watched what visibility did to people. She had seen wealth turn acquaintances into strangers and strangers into threats. She had seen the way men looked at a powerful woman, the particular cocktail of attraction and intimidation that curdled, over time, into the need to diminish her. She had decided, early, that her peace was worth more than recognition, that the right people would see her, and the wrong people, the ones who needed to see a resume before they could assign her value, would reveal themselves naturally. She was, above everything else, an observer. She noticed things, details, patterns, the micro-expressions that crossed a person's face before their words caught up, the way someone treated a waiter, the way someone referenced their own money, how often, in what context, with what kind of hunger underneath the casualness. She had noticed all of these things about Carter Voss within the first 40 minutes of meeting him, and she had still chosen to stay. That decision, the reason behind it, is something we'll come back to. They met at a private art auction on a Thursday evening in March. Serena was there because a friend had dragged her. Carter was there because he was always somewhere he could be seen by the right people. He spotted her across the room during the second auction lot. A woman who wasn't performing for anyone, who was studying a bronze sculpture with genuine curiosity instead of waiting to be noticed, and something about that stillness caught him off guard. He introduced himself the way he always did. Confident, controlled, name first, then the casual mention of the Voss group, watching her face for the flicker of recognition that almost always came. It didn't come. She shook his hand, said her name was Serena, and asked him what he thought of the sculpture. Carter, who had not actually looked at the sculpture, pivoted smoothly and asked if she collected art. "Only things I genuinely love," she said. "Not things that impress people." He laughed. He thought she was being charmingly humble. She was being entirely sincere. Over the following weeks, he pursued her with the focused energy of a man who was used to getting what he wanted. He took her to restaurants with month-long wait lists, sent arrangements that required 2 people to carry them, offered weekend trips to places that required private terminals. And Serena, who could have bought the restaurant, the florist, and the aircraft without checking her balance, accepted some invitations, declined others, and remained consistently, genuinely herself throughout all of it. That was what confused him most. She didn't seem dazzled. Women in Carter's experience were either dazzled or they were performing indifference. Serena was neither. She was simply present, curious about him, willing to be honest with him, entirely unimpressed by the scaffolding of wealth he kept erecting around himself. She asked him once, about 3 months in, why he always mentioned money when he was describing experiences. He didn't have an answer, but he filed the question away in the part of himself that didn't like being seen too clearly. The relationship grew anyway, slowly, then faster. Carter's guard, which had never fully come down with anyone, lowered just enough for something real to develop. He was drawn to her in a way that unsettled him. She was the first person in years who made him feel like he was being known rather than assessed. He told her things he had never told anyone. Old hurts, specific fears, the quiet pressure of being a boss and never being allowed to be uncertain about anything. Serena listened. She always listened. And in those moments, she loved him. Genuinely. Not the performance of him. Not the tailored jacket and the Voss Group legacy and the $10 million net worth. But the version of him that existed in the spaces between all of that. The version that surfaced sometimes when his defenses slipped. She saw that version clearly. And she also saw, with equal clarity, what surrounded it. The control came in quietly. The way water rises, so gradually that you don't register how high it's gotten until it's already at your chest. It started with small decisions. A restaurant he'd already chosen before asking where she wanted to go. An opinion corrected in front of others with the practiced smoothness of someone who had convinced himself he was simply being accurate. A comment about her car, offhand, almost gentle, that she should let him sort that out, because it wasn't really appropriate for where they were going together in life. She noticed each one. She didn't react. Reaction, she had learned long ago, was information you gave to people who hadn't yet earned it. So she watched. She cataloged. She continued asking thoughtful questions and listening carefully and presenting to the world the image of a woman who was simply, quietly, falling in love. Financial conversations began to surface around month 7. Carter would reference his portfolio in contexts that didn't require it. He'd mention specific figures at dinner, not boastfully, but with that practiced casualness that was actually a kind of pressure. Testing, always testing, to see how she'd respond. Whether she'd be impressed. Whether she'd begin to position herself in relation to his wealth the way others had. Whether she'd give him a reason to feel that his mother's warnings were justified. Serena never took the bait. Once, after he had circled the topic of finances for the 3rd time in a single evening, she set down her fork and said simply, "Carter, I don't care about your money." He smiled, reached across the table, squeezed her hand. "That's exactly what I love about you," he said. But later that night, she could see it in his eyes before he looked away. He had filed that response in the category his mother had warned him about. The women who seem least interested are the most dangerous. Something had shifted. Something small but permanent. And Serena felt it. The engagement happened on a rooftop at sunset because Carter had a talent for beautiful gestures that were also performances. She said yes. Not because she was naive. Not because she had missed the signs. She said yes because, beneath everything, beneath the control and the posturing and the constant low hum of distrust, there was still that other version of him, the one she had glimpsed in unguarded moments. And she believed, in the way that intelligent people sometimes believe things that cost them, that love and patience were enough to draw that version forward permanently. She would come to understand, in the months that followed, exactly how expensive that belief was. The engagement changed the dynamic completely. Where Carter had been controlled before, he became something harder. The warmth didn't disappear, but it receded, retreating behind an increased focus on structure and security and what he started calling, with a kind of boardroom gravity, the practical realities of building a life together. His mother became more present, more opinionated, Family dinners began to feel like performance reviews where Serena was the subject and everyone else held the clipboard. She was expected to be grateful. She was expected to understand that a man like Carter, a Voss, with a legacy to protect, was doing her an enormous favor by choosing her. Nobody said any of this directly. They didn't need to. It was in every glance Margaret sent across the dinner table, in every story about Carter's grandfather and the importance of protecting generational wealth, in the way his older brother once leaned over and said to her, voice full of what he thought was kindness, "You know you're very lucky, right? Carter doesn't let many people in." Serena smiled at all of it. She kept her hands very still, and she began, quietly, without announcement, to make some calls. All right, pause for just 1 second. If you have made it this far into the story, I genuinely want to know, are you still with me? Drop the words "still watching" in the comments right now. I can see every single comment and I read them. Let's keep going, because what happens next is the part nobody in that ballroom saw coming. The prenup conversation didn't start as a conversation. It started as a statement. 3 weeks before the engagement dinner, a formal event Carter had planned at the Harlow Grand, a private ballroom in the city's most prestigious hotel, 62 guests, including every significant name in his professional and social world. He sat across from her in the living room of his penthouse and told her they needed to discuss documentation. He used that word deliberately. Documentation, not an agreement, not something they would build together. Documentation, as if the relationship were a transaction that required proper filing. He slid a summary across the coffee table. His lawyer had prepared it. It outlined the terms under which they would enter marriage, his assets protected entirely, hers subject to review, provisions that read less like a partnership agreement and more like the terms and conditions of a service she was being permitted to use. Serena read every line. She asked 3 questions, specific, technical, the kind of questions a person asks when they understand exactly what they're reading. Carter blinked at the 3rd question. His lawyer, sitting stiffly in the armchair across the room, glanced up from his phone. "You've read contracts before," Carter said. It wasn't quite a question. "I read everything," she said. She handed the summary back to him and told him she would think about it. He took that as compliance. He always translated her calm into compliance. It was a pattern that had been working against him for longer than he knew. What Serena actually did, in the 48 hours that followed, was contact her own attorney. A woman named Rachel who operated out of a glass-walled office on the 40th floor of a building that Carter's firm had once tried and failed to acquire. She laid everything on the table. The prenup, the relationship, the engagement dinner, all of it. And she and Rachel had a conversation that lasted 4 hours and covered territory that would have genuinely stopped Carter cold if he'd had any idea it was happening. Then Serena did something else. Something she kept entirely to herself. The morning of the engagement dinner, while Carter was with his tailor and his mother was presumably somewhere reinforcing his worldview, Serena dressed simply. A deep midnight dress, no jewelry except small earrings, and went to Rachel's office. She signed a document. She had it notarized. She had copies made and placed in 3 separate locations. Then she went home, finished getting ready, and arrived at the Harlow Grand 20 minutes before the guests. She sat down at the table. She placed her hands flat on the white tablecloth, and she waited. The dinner itself was beautiful in the way that expensive, hollow things are beautiful. The food was extraordinary. The wine was extraordinary. The flowers down the center of the long table were extraordinary, extravagant arrangements of white orchids and eucalyptus that someone had spent a great deal of someone else's time constructing. Carter was at his best, charming, commanding, moving through the room with the easy authority of a man in his natural habitat. He told stories. He made people laugh. He made the kind of eye contact with Serena across the table that looked, from the outside, exactly like love. She raised her glass to him when he caught her eye. She meant it. Even then, even knowing what was coming, she meant it. Not for the performance of him, but for the grief of what she was finally, fully accepting, that the version of him she had loved was real, but it was not the version that was in charge. The version in charge was the one his mother had built, the one that needed to dominate in order to feel safe, the one that could not be in a relationship without it being, on some fundamental level, a transaction. The folder arrived between the main course and dessert. His lawyer appeared from somewhere at the edge of the room. She had wondered where he was sitting, and placed the cream-colored folder in front of her with a small, professional nod. Carter stood. The table quieted in the way tables quiet when someone with authority signals that attention is required. "I wanted to share this with the people who matter most to us," Carter said, his voice carrying easily across the room. "Because I believe in being transparent. I believe in protecting what we've built. And I believe that strong relationships are built on honest foundations." His mother dabbed the corner of her mouth with a linen napkin. Every eye in the room was on Serena. "This is just a formality," Carter continued, with that smile, that practiced, bulletproof smile. "Something to protect us both going forward. My assets, her security. Clean and simple. Clean and simple. $10 million. Carefully ringed in legal language designed to ensure that she left any future dissolution with approximately nothing. Clean and simple. Serena looked at the folder. She looked at the table. She looked, briefly, at Margaret, who was watching her with the composed expression of a woman waiting to see whether an investment would pay off. She looked at Carter's brother, who had leaned slightly forward. She looked at 61 other people whose faces were arranged in various configurations of polite discomfort and frank curiosity. And then she picked up her champagne glass, took a single slow sip, set it down, and looked up at Carter with an expression that shifted the air in the room. Not anger, not tears, not the frozen look of someone trying to survive a public humiliation. Something entirely different. Amusement. Genuine, unhurried, private amusement. And then she said, quietly and clearly, so that the nearest guests could hear, "Before I respond to this, Carter, I think there's something you should know." The room didn't move. Carter's smile held for exactly 3 seconds before the edges of it began, almost imperceptibly, to waver. "I had a conversation with my attorney this morning," Serena continued, her voice the same temperature it always was, calm, measured, with a warmth underneath that made it impossible to call cold. "And before I arrived tonight, I signed a document of my own." She reached into the small clutch on the chair beside her and placed a single piece of paper on the table next to the cream-colored folder. Not dramatically, not with force, the way you place something when you have all the time in the world. "A disclosure statement," she said, "notarized this morning, witnessed by 2 independent parties. It outlines my complete financial position so that there is no ambiguity between us moving forward." Carter stared at the paper. His lawyer stared at the paper. Margaret Voss, for the first time in Serena's memory, looked uncertain about something. "I've kept my finances private," Serena said, "because privacy has always mattered to me. Not secrecy, privacy. There's a difference. But I think tonight, given what you've placed in front of me, it's important that this table understands who they're actually looking at." She paused. That pause lasted perhaps 4 seconds. For seconds during which Carter Voss's entire understanding of the situation he was in began, slowly and irreversibly, to rearrange itself. "My current net worth," Serena said, her eyes steady on his, "is just over $300 million. The word silence doesn't quite cover what happened next. Silence suggests an absence of something. What fell over that room was more like a presence, a thick, physical weight of collective recalibration as 62 people simultaneously tried to reconcile the woman they had spent the evening quietly pitying with the number that had just entered the room and rearranged all the furniture. Someone's fork made contact with a plate. The sound was enormous. Carter's mouth opened, closed. His lawyer set his pen down very slowly on the tablecloth. Margaret Voss, The woman who had spent 2 decades constructing the belief that her son was exceptional, that women wanted him for his money, that distrust was wisdom, sat perfectly still and stared at Serena Cole with an expression that Serena would remember for a long time. Not shame exactly. Something more uncomfortable than shame. The look of a woman confronting the possibility that the framework she had built her life inside was not as solid as she had believed. Carter found his voice. He started, then stopped. Tried again. I didn't know. No, Serena agreed. You didn't. Why didn't you? Tell you. She tilted her head slightly, and there was no cruelty in her voice when she said the next thing. There was something almost kind in it, which somehow made it land harder. Because for the first 4 months, I was hoping it wouldn't matter. And for the last 8 months, I was watching to find out whether it would. She glanced at the cream folder. Now I know. Carter looked at the folder, then at her, then at the room. His brother had sat back in his chair and was looking at the tablecloth. The prenup, Serena said, is not something I'm going to sign. Not because I'm unwilling to have a legal agreement between us. Reasonable people can have reasonable agreements. But because this document wasn't written for 2 people. It was written for one person's protection, and not mine. She folded her hands on the table. The version of this relationship that I was willing to fight for. The version where we were actually partners. That version required you to see me as an equal, not a risk to be managed. She stood, not abruptly, not with the dramatic push of the chair. She rose the way she did everything, with complete and unhurried composure, the kind that comes not from performance, but from the genuine, bone-deep knowledge of exactly who you are. I'm going to leave now, she said. Not because I'm upset, but because the answer to this, she gestured at the folder without touching it, is no. And there's nothing left for me to wait for. She picked up her clutch. She looked at Carter one last time, and in that look was everything. The real grief of it, the love that had existed and was now concluding, the sorrow of watching a person choose their armor over their actual life, and she let him see all of it. She didn't hide it. She had nothing left to hide. I genuinely wanted it to be different, she said. I hope someday you do too. And then Serena Cole turned and walked through that ballroom, through 62 people who parted without being asked to, through the grand entrance of the Harlow Grand, and out into the night air. Behind her, in that beautiful, expensive, hollow room, Carter Voss stood at the head of a table with a cream-colored folder in front of him and 62 people who would be telling this story for the rest of their lives. The months that followed were not gentle to Carter. In the immediate aftermath, the days after the dinner, when the story had circulated through their social world with the speed and precision of something people genuinely couldn't stop repeating, he attempted to reach her. Messages first, then calls. Then, in a moment of desperation that surprised even him, showing up at her apartment, where he discovered that she had vacated it 3 days after the dinner and left no forwarding address with anyone he knew. She had planned for this too. Professionally, the ground began to shift underneath him in ways he hadn't anticipated. Several business relationships that had been warm turned formally polite. An acquisition he had been pursuing for 18 months fell through. The 3rd time a deal of that scale had collapsed in 2 years, which was, according to the financial press, beginning to constitute a pattern. His decision-making had grown increasingly reactive, increasingly driven by the need to prove something to someone, and reactive decision-making in Carter's industry had a way of compounding itself into something that looked, from the outside, like a slow unraveling. His mother stopped coming to Sunday dinners. He didn't know whether that was related or not. He told himself it wasn't. But alone in the penthouse that Serena had never moved into, sitting with the quiet that she had once filled with her particular brand of unhurried presence, he found himself returning, again and again, to the same moment. Not the reveal, not the number, 300 million, which still sat in his chest like something he couldn't digest. Not even the walking away, the look she had given him before she left. He had expected anger, had braced himself for it, had his responses ready. The justifications, the reasonableness, the measured explanations for why what he had done was simply practical, simply smart, simply the responsible action of a man protecting what he'd built. He had rehearsed all of it. He had not rehearsed for being seen clearly and still treated with kindness. That was the thing that stayed with him. The thing that, in the long and uncomfortable silence of the months that followed, he could not put down. She had looked at him, really looked, without armor, without performance, without needing him to be wrong so that she could be right, and she had grieved. Out loud, in front of 62 people. Not his failures, not his arrogance, not the version of himself that his mother had constructed. The loss of something real. Carter Voss had been in many rooms full of powerful people. He had never felt smaller than he did in the moment he understood what she had actually been offering him, and what he had chosen, instead, to protect himself from. Serena Cole moved through the following months the way she moved through everything. Quietly, deliberately, with the particular lightness that belongs to people who have set something heavy down. She traveled, not extravagantly. She was never extravagant, but to places she had been meaning to go for years and hadn't, because the relationship had been subtly, steadily constricting the space available for things that were purely, simply hers. She spent 3 weeks in Portugal. She finished a book she had been working on in private, a framework for ethical investment that her advisors had been asking her to formalize for years, and submitted it quietly to a small academic press. She had dinner with Rachel, her attorney, who raised a glass and said simply, "You handled that beautifully." "I didn't handle it," Serena said. "I just stopped pretending." She still thought about Carter. She wouldn't have been honest if she claimed otherwise. She thought about the version of him she had loved, that unguarded, uncertain, genuinely curious man who had surfaced in their best moments. And she allowed herself to miss him, fully and without apology, for exactly as long as it took. She didn't perform resilience. She didn't package her grief into something more flattering. She simply felt it and moved through it and came out the other side intact. This, too, was strategy, the deepest kind. The strategy of a woman who understood that her greatest asset was never the $300 million in her portfolio. It was the clarity with which she could see her own life and the courage to live it accordingly. There is a kind of power that announces itself. It rides in on achievement and recognition, on corner offices and engraved nameplates, on the specific silence that falls when an important person enters a room. That power is real. Carter Voss had built his entire identity inside of it. But there is another kind of power entirely. The kind that needs nothing from the room it walks into. The kind that doesn't require confirmation or comparison or the psychological satisfaction of watching someone else feel small. The kind that looks like stillness and is actually complete internal authority, the absolute, unshakable knowledge of your own worth that cannot be given or taken by a folder on a table at a dinner in a ballroom. Serena had that. She had always had it. She had simply been waiting for the right moment to let it be visible, not for the room, not for Carter, not even to prove a point, but because the moment had arrived when hiding it would have required her to abandon herself. And that was a line she had always known she would not cross. The night she walked out of the Harlow Grand, she stopped on the sidewalk outside and stood in the cool air for a long moment. She could hear the faint sounds of the city, traffic, distant music, the ordinary, beautiful noise of people living their lives. She thought about the prenup, about the folder, about the cream-colored certainty with which Carter had placed it in front of her, so confident that she would be grateful for the terms. She thought about her hands, resting flat and still on the white tablecloth while his lawyer approached. And she smiled. The same smile as before, private and knowing, because she had understood something that night that was worth more than any figure in any portfolio. The most dangerous thing you can do to someone who has decided you are small is to simply, finally, show them your actual size. She hadn't done it to wound him. She had done it because she was done making herself smaller to fit inside someone else's comfort. That was the difference, and it made all the difference. So here is what this story leaves with you. Quiet is not weakness. Calm is not surrender. And a person who does not announce their value to a room has not forfeited it. They are simply waiting, patiently, strategically, with complete internal stillness, for the moment when showing it becomes necessary. The people who most need you to feel small are always the people most frightened of your actual size. Protect your peace. Know your worth. Let neither be up for negotiation. And never, ever mistake someone's restraint for their limits. If this story moved something in you, if you found yourself nodding or breathing differently or forwarding it to someone who needed to hear it, then this channel was made for you. Subscribe. Join this community of people who believe that the quietest voice in the room is sometimes the most powerful one. Every week, I bring you stories exactly like this one, about strength, about dignity, about the extraordinary things that happen when people finally stop shrinking. Thank you for watching.